Holland, AFP's Senior Fellow for Energy and Climate Policy. I'm going to briefly introduce our program today, and then I'll turn it over to our two illustrious speakers. ASP is pleased to partner with the Weather Channel to present Weather, Climate, and National Security. For some background, ASP is a small think tank devoted to studying the big issues of national security. For many years, we've studied the threats that climate change poses to national security. Going back, you can go back to on our website, and actually I encourage you all to go to nationalsecurityandclimatechange.org. Instead of bringing reams of paper and everything, we felt like the day after Earth Day we'd save a couple of trees and have you go to the website instead. But you can see many research papers that we've done over the last 5 or 6 years on the impacts of climate change on national security. Most recently, yesterday, we put out a new fact sheet, the 10 facts you need to know about climate change. Basically, what you need to know and why it's important to America's national security. The bottom line, though, is that we find the threats of climate change are real, are here today, and it's not just a threat around the world. This is a threat to America's homeland security as much as it is to global stability and security around the world. I'll introduce both of our presenters here, and then I'll turn it over to them. Bryan Norcross is the Weather Channel's hurricane guru. Well, technically his title is Senior Hurricane Specialist, but it seems like he's the hurricane guru. He's been in broadcasting for 47 years. He just told me that his first hurricane broadcast was when Hurricane Camille hit Mississippi in 1969. He's best known for his work on Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Last fall, he visited the Philippines shortly after Typhoon Haiyan made landfall. He has important insights into the intersection between policy, communications, weather, and climate. Really, the way that weather plays with climate and how they intersect, and then how all of that kind of comes into our policy and our national security. And then after that, we'll hear from my boss, Brigadier General Steve Cheney, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. He graduated from the Naval Academy and then spent 30-plus years in the Marine Corps doing a variety of roles around the Pacific, here at home. His final command was down at Paris Island, and he has a story he'll tell you about hurricanes from that as well. We are pleased to be here, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bryan Norcross.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for coming today. Thank you, General, for having us here. It's a pleasure to be in Washington. The Weather Channel is doing everything we can to get people thinking about these issues, because they are absolutely critical on a day-to-day basis, on a decade-by-decade basis, and looking further in the future. I found in talking to people, I'm talking to people about weather for a long time and climate for the last several years, it's hard to know how to think about these things, right? You hear a lot of stuff, and how do you put this in your mind, and how is weather and climate related? For example, is the winter, the nasty winter that's been here in Washington, everybody likes to complain about this past winter, is that somehow related to the changing climate? With Hurricane Sandy somehow related to the fact that the climate is changing because we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? How about Hurricane Katrina? What are these relationships? And if we can't know for absolute sure, how can we think about them in an accurate way? Well, I have a different kind of climate talk for you here today. There are no charts and graphs. Did that as a favor, and maybe a one-of-a-kind thing. We always try and break new ground, But I hope I can give you a mental framework for how to think about how weather and climate fit together, and how all that plays together into a security question, and why the people that study this, that make their living around the world studying this, and you hear about them in terms of the IPCC, but there are other people outside of that group as well, but why they are so concerned. If you go to talk to them and you talk to them independently, you get this feeling of major concern because of what they have learned in their individual research. And I want to give you an idea of how that research works. And I'll answer the question, was this last winter related to climate, and how about Katrina, and how about Sandy? The answer really is no, that this past winter was not especially distinguished. It was just different than we've had for a while. Sandy and Katrina were really not that strong by historical standards when they came ashore. But the answer to, are we altering the climate, is absolutely yes. The climate is different today than it would have been were we not pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and doing a number of other things as well. So you have both of those things going on. The climate is different, absolutely sure. But secondly, just because it is different doesn't mean that everything that it is doing is necessarily bad or threatening. But so how we put those two thoughts together, that's what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, let's start by distinguishing weather from climate and what the difference is. And I actually have a metaphor for you here between these two. For weather, think of them as rolling two dice. Okay, when we roll dice, we know that certain numbers come up more often than other numbers. So I'm going to use for our metaphor, the weather outside on a given day is related to rolling those two dice in a certain spot. So these are the Washington dice. We roll them, and let's just say that they come up, and 6 means a certain kind of weather, a 12 means bad weather, a 2 means bad weather. So something like this. In the middle ground there comes up most of the time, and if it happens to get some of these less likely things, those we'll call bad, extreme, and dangerous. Obviously, these are not the absolute percentages in the climate, these are the percentages in dice, but it's the idea that there is a certain amount of repeat randomness, and if we roll those dice over and over and over again, that's the percentages that will come, each of those numbers that come up. I mean, that's what Scraps is based on, right? Is sevens come up more often than anything else. So think of that as a metaphor for the weather. In these percentages, 67% of the time, it's more or less normal in that middle range, and then less of the time, it's in that bad to extreme range to 1 degree or the other. Now, here's the climate is a whole lot of dice, right? The dice are rolling all over the world. There are thousands of dice rolling. Well, if you do that, they're all good dice, and you're rolling them, and you're rolling them, and you're rolling them, you're going to end up with the same percentages, right? Because they're all equal. So you still end up with, just say, 67% as normal weather, and then you have these extremes. But there's a difference when you start talking about climate and weather, and that is that embedded in the climate, you always have places where you get 2 sixes, right? So you always have extreme weather. And extreme and dangerous weather is just an intrinsic part of the climate. So it's just because the climate is happening all around the earth, sometimes that extreme weather might be happening in China, and sometimes it might be happening in the United States. This is a kind of normal look at everything is normal before we goof with anything to make it different. And so 12, remember, was our dangerous level. Now, let's go back to the weather again. Now suppose what we do is we load normally you have that 17% at the bottom. Now, if we load those dice, like we put 2 sixes on one of the dies, you still have most of the weather in the normal range, but now the extreme weather is 22%. I mean, these are the odds if you happen to have 2 dice, one is normal and one happens to have 2 sixes on it instead of the 4. Those are the odds you get. And so that's the idea here, is that if you load the climate dice by increasing the number of sixes, by pushing it to the edge, right, by forcing it in a certain direction that is different than it would normally be equally distributed, you end up being on the extreme edge more often. Not all the time. We expect normal weather most of the time, but you encourage the development of more severe weather because you end up with sixes coming up more often by not having a full playing field, but by pushing it over in the direction of, in this case, by warming the atmosphere. But there are other factors involved as well. So that's the mental framework that we work with in thinking about how is the climate and the weather related. The weather is one little part of the climate, but the odds of distribution are really equal until you start forcing it, and the weather just more often is affected, but not always. All right, so what can we say? There's a lot of things you hear about the climate, about evidence that the climate is changing. What can we say that we know that everybody can agree on? We know that in the 9th to the 13th century, about 1,000 years ago, the Earth was warmer. It's called the medieval warming period. A lot of theories about why that was the case, but we know obviously that was the pre-industrial era, so that didn't have to do with additional human-induced carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but it was a warmer period that folks that look at climate like to talk about. And then we also know that after that, there was a little ice age from the 16th to the 19th century. It wasn't really an ice age. And by the way, just like that picture, the Delaware River, even these days, sometimes gets ice in it. But it was unusually cold during this period, and especially during the late 18th century and into the 19th century. In 1780, New York Harbor froze, and you could walk from Manhattan over to Staten Island. It was an exceptionally cold time. There are theories about that as well that involve the sun and other things. But the fact was, through natural processes, both of those things happened. But then when that, by its natural process, was ending, there was a confluence of things that humans got into the business of creating factories, creating carbon dioxide, burning coal, moving into the modern age or the industrial age. And by this confluence of events, the natural process of the Little Ice Age was ending when the human-induced warming period was starting. And so what we see today in the industrial age and the advanced industrial age is that the warming exceeds what we saw in the medieval period, because we think that we're in a natural warming trend, plus on top of it, the human-induced warming trend. So when people say, oh, it's just a natural cycle, it's true. I think it is a natural cycle with the Little Ice Age ended and the Earth is warming, but also we have the human-induced component in it, and we can actually detect that, and I'll explain how in just a second. So one of the artifacts, obviously, is the shrinking sea ice. You see the area there, the average where the minimum ice in the summertime shrunk in 1979 to 2000, and where it was in 2010. Well, let's not talk about exactly how that's happening, but just concentrate on the fact that it is happening, and so you have that area of ice, and you have a lot more water, just on that fact. Less ice, more water. Well, what does that mean? Well, if there's ice there over the ocean, that means that the sun's heat is reflecting, and the surface of the ocean is below freezing. By definition, it's ice, right? So it's got to be below freezing. So when it's below freezing, as you know, cold air sinks and warm air rises. So the cold air is sinking. So the air is generally sinking over that area where the ice was. But now if you melt it, now it's different, because now, by definition, it's above freezing at the water, and so that air is relatively rising there. So what you've done over a large area of the Arctic Ocean is you've replaced what would be sinking if it was frozen with air that's now rising. And so the fact is that it's different. That doesn't mean it's worse. It just, for this point of discussion, means it's different, and it's kind of like this. If I have a room here, and I have the windows open on the left and the right, and there's a breeze blowing through it, there's my breeze. There's my normal condition, the airflow. But if I turn on that fan there, it just changes the airflow some. Right? Doesn't change it a lot, but it changes it some. And the fact is that if you take the air and you move it a little bit, so now it's coming over the mountain before it gets to the city, as opposed to coming here, it was coming off the water. This can be a dry flow, and that can be a warm flow, and it doesn't take much difference to make that change. So this is why we see, with fairly subtle changes in the circulation, bottom line is you change the circulation and you change the weather in some locations that are subject to slight changes in the circulation. The direction the air is coming from, the amount of air, can be pretty subtle and make a pretty significant effect. That's why weather's hard to predict, by the way, is because subtle differences can make pretty significant differences in the weather. So it's really important to understand, and that gets to the point that you don't have to change things a lot to change the weather. And that's why I said at the beginning that the weather we have outside today is different than it would have been if we weren't heating the atmosphere as much as we are, because we can see just in the Arctic, let alone all the other places where there is ground now where there used to be ice, we're changing the circulation some. Now, not necessarily for the worse, but we're changing it some. So, why is it warming? Well, it's warming for at least 3 reasons. We'll make it 3 buckets. One is that the Little Ice Age ended. We think that was a natural process that is related to sun activity, the amount of energy coming from the sun, and some other factors, maybe volcanic activity that affected the temperature of the Earth in general through that period. But that's over, and so the Earth started to warm through natural processes. Also, we're putting carbon dioxide in the air. That is just the same as throwing a blanket around the Earth. Not a big blanket, but it's a blanket. So add those 2 together, and you get the warming that you have today. Is when you add in other factors, both plus and minus. Some natural, some to do with human activities, but that's why it's not just warming. It warms and then it actually levels off and starts to warm again and it levels off, because there are many factors involved in the overall temperature of the Earth. But if you look at the Arctic is warming straight on, and that trend shows no reason, we have no reason to think that trend will not continue. How do we know that the carbon dioxide is coming from humans? It turns out that the carbon from fossils, as in fossil fuel, as in like really super old dead things, is different, has a different chemical signature than the carbon that comes from other factors. So when you go and you suck the carbon dioxide out of the air and you start looking at the carbon, you see that there's more of that type of carbon now than there used to be. When you go look at an air bubble that came from 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, you can look and see what the carbon looks like in the carbon dioxide in that bubble, and it has a different signature today because more of the carbon dioxide is coming from burning fossil fuel, or it's the fossil type carbon. So that's a real straightforward way that we know that where the carbon dioxide is coming from. Yes, it's coming from all the natural processes that make carbon dioxide, but it's also increasingly coming from the fossil fuel direction. So that's just a framework to think about what's happening in the atmosphere, how the atmosphere is warming. And one of the artifacts of that I really want to get your attention focused on is sea level rise. The sea level is rising, and for 2 reasons fundamentally. One is that in the Arctic and the Antarctic, ice is melting, more water is going into the ocean. You just have more water, the water rises, like pouring more water into the bathtub. The water rises in the bathtub. The other is, on the East Coast, that the coastal land is sinking. It's called the Ice Age rebound. So what happened is when that ice came down during the last ice age, it pushed down on the ground, and the part that didn't have the ice kind of lifted up like a seesaw. Then when that ice melted, now the ground is settling again. So from North Carolina north, the ground is sinking so that the ocean is actually rising faster there than it's rising in other places around the planet and around the U.S. Here's an example of Norfolk. Up at the top there, that's just tidal flooding. That's just a high tide. So there are neighborhoods in Norfolk now because they've had 14 inches of sea level rise plus land sinking there in the last 100 years or so. And look at this here. That's an island in the early 20th century off of the coast of Norfolk there in Chesapeake Bay called Holland Island. And there it was in 2010 with the last house, and that house finally gave way and sank into the water in the storm in November of 2010. And now at high tide, that island is completely gone. So that's a combination of the sea level has come up and the land has sunk. And there were about 70 buildings on that island. It was a thriving community back at the turn of the 20th century. And that same thing is happening in Miami. Where I live in Miami, now the city of Miami Beach is fewer than 100,000 people. Is spending $400 million putting in a massive pumping system to make the city livable for the next few decades. So, because at high tide, the water comes in floods and people are trapped in their homes. That happens to be a rich community that can afford to do that. But this is a problem around the coast in one fashion or the other. So what's going to happen, what do we know, and why do we have confidence that we know? So the way that the scientists that are writing for the IPCC and that do climate research do their work is fundamentally with computer models. And if you read a lot about this, you hear about the computer models, and you hear people talking about why you know we can't forecast the weather for Saturday. How can we possibly forecast the weather for 50 years from now, right? Probably like that. Well, here's why we have confidence in the models and how they work. What the scientists do is they design equations that approximate the atmosphere. So in other words, if all the dice were the climate, well, we don't have computers big enough to model and putting equations for every single aspect of the climate. So they pick the main ones, and they pick a set of them. And then they run the equations and they say, does that, if I put in the temperature of the ocean in 1950 and I put in the carbon dioxide in 1950 and I put in these factors, do I end up with results that look like 1950 weather? If I do it for 2014, do I end up with results that look like current weather? If I do that, then I have some confidence in the future if I change it to approximate the future that's right. And you do that over and over again with different approximations and have different scientists that do it independently. So by having all these independent people doing this thinking and coming up with similar conclusions, that's where the confidence comes from. And what we do is we load the dice of the future in various different kinds of ways, and we don't put in the carbon dioxide and see what happens. Then we put in the carbon dioxide and see how it's different in a whole lot of different scenarios, and that's how we end up with confidence and definitive statements about some changes that we can be fairly sure about and some less sure about in the future. Because some changes that have to do with drought and sea level rise and other factors all come out of these simulations, but maybe over a range, and that's why you hear of a range. Some simulations might say the water's going to rise by 4 feet, some might say it's going to rise by 2 feet, and that's why you end up with a range. But this is done thousands, tens of thousands of times with different simulations and different people coming up with similar answers, and that's why you get a consensus among scientists. So the independent conclusions are the climate is always changing, it's always changed, it'll continue to change by natural forces, but now we're changing it by human forces as well. The carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is an increasing component of the array of factors that change the climate. So that's the way to think of it. There are a lot of reasons the climate is changing. This is an increasing component driving the climate in a particular direction, restricting the number of ways the climate can behave. The threat from severe weather will increase due to climate change, but extreme weather is always part of the normal climate. So every time we have severe weather doesn't mean that it had something to do with climate, but the computer projections are, and the consensus is that we are pushing the climate toward more extremes by loading the climate dice in our metaphor. And the future threat from climate and weather has to be treated as the national security threat that it is. Now, I just want to leave you with two thoughts, because I know you've heard a lot of this before, a lot of doomsday projections. When I show a picture like that, you go, oh, wow, Photoshop is an incredible thing, right? But here's the thing, is first of all, the sea level rise and its derivative threats, the variety of things that come from sea level rise, including the damage to fresh water supplies and economic and physical and health issues and all of that, just that issue is enough, should be enough to motivate people to take action against this problem. Just that. The General's going to talk about lots of other factors that climate change brings to play on our society and our country, but just that is monumental, because I know that everybody thinks about, and the feeling that we have over the last few decades, or maybe the last decade and a half, is that we've had so much bad weather, so many bad storms, Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina and all those storms. The fact is, if you look at the east coast of the United States and the Florida Peninsula, we've had fewer than a third as many strong hurricanes, Category 3 and above, over the last 50 years than we had over the 50 years before that. If we went back to having, by what we think is a natural cycle of strong hurricanes developing in the Atlantic and threatening the United States, if we went back to that, people would think the world was coming to an end. If we had 5 Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricanes hitting South Florida in a period of 6 years, what would happen to the economy? Not to mention that we don't have the ability as a country, with the resources that the United States has, to deal with that, and we really are not planning for it. We think in the present. Like I said, most folks think, including me, being in Atlanta, it was a terrible winter in Atlanta. Oh, it's so cold, it's so cold. It wasn't that big a deal. When I, am honest with myself, when I was in Atlanta in 1983, it was a lot colder. And in 1985 was a lot colder. So we tend to think about the more recent times that we have this kind of visceral feeling about. But if you really look at it objectively, we have been extraordinarily lucky that our inaction and our piling of people and wealth in harm's way, without taking the mitigating action that really is required, that we haven't really gotten caught. And in Hurricane Sandy, we had a tremendous amount of damage, ended up being $68 billion. It's not impossible to have a $200 billion storm. And not to mention the economic effects of taking out the financial center of the world, because the storm is not barely a Category 1 storm, but it's a Category 3 storm, because the effects magnify. So that's what I wanted to leave you with more than anything else, is an appreciation for the fact that these threats are real. The threats are increasing in the long term, but they're here today. And if it were a foreign agent that was posing this kind of threat to the United States, we would be taking action, as opposed to the atmosphere and the oceans and what we're doing to alter them, plus what they do on their own, being the threat that it is, that we are really not taking either defensive action or mitigative action against. We're really not doing either one. Thank you very much.
I suppose there's a great contrast to having a Marine follow a scientist giving a speech. But Senator Warner, we're glad you came this afternoon, a fellow Marine, and I think you'll certainly understand the security message that I'm about to talk with regards to climate change. Some would ask, what's the American Security Project's interest in climate change? And back in 2006, 4 senators, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, got together and they said there's a number of topics that when they got discussed by them, principally got painted in a political context, and one way or the other, people would not look at the facts, wouldn't understand it. And they said, can we not put together an educational group, a 501c3, that would take all of these issues from a national security slant? So he did get an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, as those 4 I mentioned, put another equal number of businessmen and women to help support us, but then added 8 flag officers, 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, 2 from each service, who could talk about the national security perspective on each one of our issues. And climate change was perhaps number 1 of those. We do energy security, nuclear security, asymmetric operations, terrorism, and American competitiveness, and a number of others. But I would say climate change and energy security, which are related, are top of our list. And you might ask, what's the Defense Department's interest in this? What's the military department's interest? And I point out up here, you see on the slide, our latest publication from DoD is the Quadrennial Defense Review, and there's a direct quote out of the QDR. And the fact of the matter is, everybody expects our defense establishment to defend our country and be prepared just to do that. And they view climate change as a threat and it's certainly creating instability worldwide, and I'm going to give you a number of examples about that. Now, we're not alone in this particular regard. This last year, I got asked the question, okay, if our DoD recognizes this, what about the national security strategy of everybody else in the world? So we kind of took it upon ourselves to canvass the world, literally. We called each country and asked them to page up their national security strategy and see if they had climate change written into it as a threat to their stability. And surprisingly, 70% did. You can see all those in green up there where they viewed it as a national security threat, yellow as an environmental issue, red, not so much a concern, gray, no information available. And what we found was of those 70%, all of them had an established military department, they had a national security apparatus. The 30% that don't either didn't have a national security strategy or were involved in other things. You can see most of those are probably in sub-Saharan Africa. But I found it curious that so many, and including, of course, Russia and China, also view climate change as a threat to their national security. You know, there's all kinds of hot spots in this world, and I can pull the thread on a number of them, and I'm going to give you a few examples. People say, well, show me an example where climate change has caused instability and where our military had to react. And there's a lot of them there, but I'll give you just but a couple. The most recent and perhaps more poignant one is Mali, where the Tuaregs in South Mali moved because of severe drought. They couldn't farm their crops, and they had to go to the northern part of the country. To some who are familiar there was a bit of an insurrection. They had a problem. They had a little bit of a civil war. That's one case where you can put a direct tie to climate change and the drought which caused them to move. Now, this next one's a little bit of a stretch, but it's proven. The Arab Spring, everybody's aware of what happened in Libya and Egypt. Part of the contributing factor to that was the rising prices of wheat worldwide. And what caused that wheat price to go up in large part were the forest fires in Eastern Europe and in Russia in 2010, and it caused those prices to spike. Bread, of course, is a huge staple in the Middle East. Those prices went up, and it created some instability, and some folks protested against the prices, and that was a little bit of a spark that helped create Arab Spring. Now, I realize that's a bit of a draw, but indeed, it was a contributor to instability. Some other hotspots I'll point out, and this one is really, really interesting, and it's Bangladesh on the left. And when you look at Bangladesh, a country of about 150 million people, 5.5 million of them live directly on the coast. And if they get a 1.5-foot sea rise over the next 30 years, those 5.5 million have to go. They know they have to go. And Bangladesh is aware of this. But the question is, where are they going to go? And they're probably not going to India, where there is indeed a huge armed border. I'm not sure they're going to go over to Myanmar either. We see this as a huge problem there, and it's going to create great instability in that region of the world. And of course, when you pull that thread even farther, you've got other countries that have particular interest, not the least of which are India, China, and Pakistan, nuclear-armed countries who are not going to welcome any of these refugees from Bangladesh. We know pretty much for fact, and Bryan laid it out, the sea is going to rise 1.5 feet there in the next 30 years. They are going to have 5.5 million refugees. They have a problem. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I point out some things on the right. You can see the Marine response in 2010 to the floods in Pakistan. Of course, everybody's aware of Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. We had 13,000 of our own military respond to that particular typhoon. And it seems like whenever there's a problem worldwide, certainly related to natural disasters, the U.S. ends up being the #1 responder to all these events because perhaps we're the only ones who really can. You can see on the left, there's a good shot of that particular typhoon. I would just point out that a number of our bases worldwide, not just in the continental United States, are threatened. Certainly in the South Pacific, Diego Garcia, I feel fairly confident in predicting that in 30 to 50 years, Diego Garcia will go underwater. That's a significant logistics base for us there. We're going to have to move those materials somewhere else. Guam, for instance, is going to be threatened. The Marines are talking about moving from Okinawa to Guam today, when in the long term that might not be so wise given what might end up happening to Guam. Other hot spots, you can see the coastal threats here in the United States. 5% or 50% of the U.S. population lives in coastal counties. And I think Bryan pointed out what's going on in Miami, but there are certainly many other coastal communities that are hugely threatened. I can give you about 2 examples personally of this experience. When I was the commanding general at Parris Island, the day I took over, my predecessor said, "You're really going to have one big problem." And I said, you know, here I was thinking it's going to be drill instructors, or I'm going to have a problem with recruits, or whatever. He says, it's going to be hurricanes. 90 days later, Hurricane Floyd took dead aim at Parris Island, Category 5. Parris Island's mean sea level rise is about 12 feet. They predicted a 28-foot storm surge. I had 8,000 recruits on deck. I had to move them along with about 5,000 other people a couple hundred miles inland. You can imagine what a logistical nightmare that was. And we did it. Fortunately, Floyd did not hit us hard. It glanced, but it went into North Carolina. And some may remember it cut Route 95 for 2 weeks. Just but one example there. And I'll give you another short one. I went down and took a prep school, command of a prep school down in Arlington, Texas, the Marine Military Academy. When I flew in there in 2006, the Rio Grande Valley was verdant green, sorghum, cotton, cattle. I mean, it really was a nice area. When I left in 2011, none of that was there. No cattle industry. All the crops were virtually dry. And I know the Weather Channel has been doing a great series on drought, particularly in Texas this last couple of days. If you haven't seen those pieces, you ought to, and see what the drought is doing in Texas. And you would hope that they would wake up down in Texas, but sometimes I'm not always sure. Military bases here in the United States, Norfolk Naval Air Station down in Norfolk, and they are well aware of this, is probably going to go underwater here in the next 20 years. So it's got to move somewhere else. Hampton Roads, that whole area is going to be very susceptible. There are infrastructure problems all around. Eglin Air Force Base in Florida will also probably go underwater as well. Brian mentioned that there are other impacts, of course, energy, and I mentioned how energy overlaps what we do at the American Security Project. Some probably don't know that when Hurricane Sandy hit lower Manhattan, it knocked out the big Con Ed plant in South Manhattan, and they were without power for about 3 weeks. There were some 20 other nuclear power plants in the path of Hurricane Sandy. Of those, 2 of them had to be shut down because of that particular hurricane. So it's undoubtedly going to impact our electrical grid. And I mentioned the droughts in agriculture in South Texas. Of course, that's nationwide. There's drought all over. And again, when you watch the Weather Channel, and I watched it again this morning, when they showed the drought predictions in the Southwest, they're pretty stark, and you listen to the farmers. We have a problem. So you might ask, do I have an answer to this? And there are some answers, and there's a whole panoply of things that we can do. No doubt about it, we've got to reduce CO2 emissions. But I often get questions from the right saying, you know, this is just BS. We don't believe in any of this climate change stuff. But from the military perspective, you always plan on the worst case scenario. So there's never 100% certainty on the battlefield, but if you know there's a potential threat, you're going to plan against it. So we know climate change is going to come. So the Department of Defense is working this issue pretty hard, but a lot of that situation resolved or questions or answers reside here on Capitol Hill with what you can do legislation-wise, and certainly with things like CO2 emissions. We've got to adapt. We have to mitigate. The emissions are our biggest problem, bar none. The military will continue to prepare contingency plans, and I will tell you, and I hearken back to the Coordinating Defense Review, which lists climate change in there as a huge threat. They get it and they understand it, but certainly in the long term, they can't be the solution to our problem that resides somewhere else. With that, I want to thank the Weather Channel and David Cheney and your folks. It gives us another forum here. The American Security Project has been going around the country here this last couple of months, and we are embarked now on a 2-year program of not talking about this just inside the Beltway. We started in Pittsburgh, went to San Francisco, we were in Tennessee last week. We are going to go, not to every state, but to most, to get this exact message that we're talking about today so that the general public understands it. And I will tell the folks here that you'd be surprised at the number of local community people, the mayors, that really understand the threat to their communities and recognize that and need help in combating climate change. So with that, I want to stop my presentation and open it up to see if you have any questions. And Andrew, do you want to moderate?
I do want to moderate. Thank you, Steve. So I would just ask that you, when you ask a question, phrase it in the form of a question, not a statement. Wait for the microphone to come around and get you. Direct it to either one of them, and yeah, we look forward to hearing you. Get the microphone there. Yeah, right there. Right there in the center.
Hi, Judy and all of you. It seems like there's a program, a movement, people out there saying that this is all BS, as you alluded to. Who's doing it? Why are they doing it? Where's the funding coming from? What's your reaction? What percentage of the scientists believe what you're saying and believe what they're saying?
Well, I can quickly address the. I don't think it's our place to get involved in who's funding whoever else. But the numbers on the science are very stark. There was 2 years ago, there was a report that came out that surveyed the climate scientists and meteorologists working in this, and it's 97% agreed with the basic science. And I would go even further. There was another report looking at all of the peer-reviewed scientific studies published in 2013, about 2,200 and something. And of those, one of them disagreed with the basic science of climate change is caused by man-made CO2. So that's a pretty stark number, but what would you say, Bryan?
Well, is that on? Yeah. Okay. So I've talked to a number of contrarians on the subject, and what I find is that if they're honest with themselves, if they are real scientists and they really have looked into it, that the issue is not so much the science. That is the CO2 changing the circulation? Is that affecting the weather? Is the sea level rising? Is the Arctic ice? Is there less Arctic ice than there was historically before the planet was warming? Those issues are fairly incontrovertible. There are some people that want to argue about that, but that's really on the fringe. The bigger issues is where the scientists think that what the next step should be. I had somebody who's very well read say to me the other day that, well, we don't have the technology now to really deal with this, so we'll spend a lot of money to try and do it, and then my answer is, well, but shouldn't we be developing the technology, right? Wouldn't we want the United States to develop the technology, and shouldn't we, like we've solved other big problems in the past, invest in that so that we lead that? But so some of it is that indeed we don't have good answers to the solution side, and that's a stumbling block for people that think that it should be put off the solution because it's expensive, and it will indeed change what we can do. We can't live the way we're living without being affected by the changing climate and the threat from weather. We're building monstrous buildings and piling people at the coast where the sea level is rising. Just start there. Those two things can't coexist. So we do have to change. And so you have people that are just reluctant to accept the fact that we have to adapt as a culture and a country to the reality of this problem. And so they push back at the end of the discussion, not so much at the underlying science level. That's anecdotal, but that's my experience.
It's a great segue into ASP talking about energy security, and these two issues overlap greatly. And a lot of people look at the latest fracking business with the oil boom and the gas boom and saying we're going to be energy independent. And we kind of view it in a different perspective. We say it gives us a bridge to invest more in research and development in alternative energies. Now, whether those are renewables or fusion or other alternatives to burning of fossil fuels, we think all of them are perhaps better than what we're doing right now.
Yeah, here. It's coming. Hold on. It's coming. We need it for the video.
With the impact on critical infrastructure, and I'm primarily looking at electricity production, and our network across the country for the grid. It's, for lack of a better term, it's fragile. We need one section of the grid to go down, and it can cause cascading failure. My question is there any plans afoot to harden our electric system in the country? Because we do know when we have power outages and power failures like we had in August 2003, we were lucky because it was a post 9/11, everybody got a long time. Now, 11 years later, we might not be so lucky. So is there any plans afoot to harden the electric grid or maybe protect coastal power plants and things that could be damaged by sea level rise?
Well, Steve mentioned that we're on a nationwide tour. I was down in Tennessee a week and a half ago, and I asked TVA exactly that. Extreme weather means extreme windstorms, extreme rain events, and that they agreed that that's a threat to the grid, whether it's your generating stations or it's the power lines. Some of it is very low-tech solutions, just widening the right-of-way, cutting trees. But a lot of that hasn't been done for a long time, and they made clear that they're doing what they can. They need they're behind on it because it's been a long time that we haven't done this. So, it's only the last few years that we've started to think about this and started to move in that direction. So there's low-tech things, and then there's higher-tech opportunities as well. And I think there have been stuff moving through Congress, but I'm not the expert on that.
I'm trying to remember a statistic yesterday that was quoted to us by Assistant Secretary of the Army Hammock about the number of power outages on bases. It was 4 times as many.
Yeah, it was 4 times as many power outages on bases over the last decade as previous decades. Because of what was it?
Weather-related.
Weather-related and weather-related events.
And so clearly, again, here's a case where DOD was looking at the energy consumption and the power outages on their bases and stations and how they could fix that and become more independent. And they mentioned a number of alternatives. One of them was small modular reactors, which I suppose. So, I mean, in terms of hardening, we at ASP certainly agree with you that the infrastructure is crumbling and they got to do something about it. The solution probably resides in the building we're sitting in.
It occurs to me there's really an expanded topic there, but around what you mentioned, and that is our electronic infrastructure in general. One of the talks I generally do these days and have been doing for some time is that our ability to communicate today in a significant emergency is actually significantly worse than it was 20 years ago. And that's because we are so dependent on the internet and cell phone systems. And I've worked in the media for forever and ever, and it used to be that we had systems in our newsroom where if we didn't have any cellular phones, we had alternate radios that we would use. We had radios, remember the old radios in news car? So we could do news coverage without the cell phone system working. Well, after any significant hurricane, I mean strong hurricane, category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane, the cell phone system was not going to work. I mean, we know that during the Washington earthquake, we couldn't make calls. So if you have a news gathering system that is dependent on, or an information gathering system that's dependent on cell phones working, you can't gather information. That we have the infrastructure, not just the electrical infrastructure, but the communications infrastructure is so much more fragile now than it was decades ago, that our ability to respond effectively to a significant disaster, and we just haven't had one since Hurricane Andrew. You have to go back to 1992, and it hit suburban Miami. It didn't hit the core city. It hit in the suburbs, so the core city could respond and help the suburbs, right? And you could get in and out. But it took 2 months. They had to put up every power pole new in that part of Dade County. The entire electrical grid was destroyed. There was no communications locally there in the storm zone. And if you translate that to an American city, over the core of the city, and you can imagine no power, no water, and no communications. What is the security aspect of that on all fronts, personal security, government facility security, every kind of security you can imagine. If you can't communicate, and we are so dependent on a fragile system, it's really, I think, a critical security problem.
Yeah, we've got two here. Wait for the microphone to come down on this side. We'll start right here, right in front of our.
What are the main renewable energy initiatives that you think would be the most effective at bolstering our national security? Do you think that the military will reach its goal of renewable energy, 25% renewable energy by 2025? And do you think this is enough?
You know, what DOD is doing in regards to energy consumption is remarkable in reduction, and it's a huge success story. The Air Force has met all its targets, in most cases ×2. For those not familiar, the number one consumer of fossil fuels in the world is our Department of Defense. But they've made great strides in their reduction in the burning of fossil fuels, but they clearly understand how vulnerable they are to fossil fuels, the prices, the sources, and all that kind of business. And that's one of the things where they've been pushing on the biofuel side of the house, is to wean themselves off of imported fossil fuels or fossil fuels, period. Making your own in terms of biofuels, and of course biofuels has its own problems, and you've seen reports lately, but they're making great strides in that regard, and be able to burn biofuels in almost all their aircraft, and the Navy can do it in almost all their ships that are fuel burning as well. We at the American Security Project recommend that the United States pursue research and development in a number of technologies. You heard me mention fusion. We've gotten the fusion community together here a number of times and said, stop saying 30 years away. They've been saying it for 30 years. We think now we've got them saying, if appropriately funded, they can get a demonstration reactor done in 10 years. And we think they can too. I mean, the science is proven on fusion, by the way. The engineering is not, and that's the problem. Certainly, if we can put a man on the moon, we can do fusion energy, but we won't put the resources to do that. So those are just but a couple of examples. I mentioned small modular reactors. Our take on nuclear energy is pretty clean, it's pretty efficient. What's left over is a problem. And that problem needs to be solved. And it hasn't been solved. So it's got a significant drawback there. Andrew, any other recommendations?
Yeah, all I would say is that any system is vulnerable in terms of a security side that is dependent on one single thing. You don't want to make a grid that is dependent on one single fuel or one single source. You want a redundant and resilient grid. So that means a lot of different things. And that means interlacing and overlapping issues. And when you talk about extreme weather events, the places that have redundant and resilient grids do better.
Bryan mentioned our dependence on communications and being a Marine. You can understand if you've got a Marine at a forward operating base, he's got to have the ability to communicate. And how does he do that? He does that with electronics. Normally that's batteries or it's a generator, take your pick. And in Afghanistan, as you may be familiar, they've experimented a lot with solar power, and it's worked on the forward operating basis where you just get solar power during the day, and if you've got appropriate batteries, that leads me into my next recommendation is researching the battery technology, is getting batteries that have significantly more capacity that can absorb the energy during the day and store it up for days on end. That's another solution to a lot of our fossil fuel burning problems.
So weather and climate naturally precipitate changes in environmental or ecosystem factors. These have a large impact on healthcare and epidemiology. I have a three-pronged question. So what do you feel are the major factors or impediments that this will pose to the healthcare system? What is our national response plan to that? And do you feel that there's a cascading effect, say, in an epidemiological situation, which would be posed to national security from people trying to alter the infrastructure if they're not receiving health care that they need in a time frame that they wish?
Healthcare. We included it in our climate security report. Go to www.nationalsecurityandclimatechange.org to download it. We included threats to health, to human health from climate change. And they include things like changing vectors for diseases, possible returns of new mosquitoes and places where mosquitoes come in. Also, air quality. If you have more extreme heat days, you're going to have lower air quality, and that, especially in inner city areas, can harm human health. I haven't done too much more than that on healthcare and the cascading effects. And I think that's, sometimes we in the national security community focus on the acute problems, the acute national security threats. The extreme weather storm that comes in, knocks out your power, knocks out services, and how do you deal in the acute? When you talk about the chronic and the long-term issues, that's a completely different problem and a different issue.
There was a great article in The Economist 2 weeks ago that addressed this specific issue, and what it said was it's not proven what climate change is doing on the health side of the house. Is it not spreading disease? They're just not sure. Andrew pointed out that one of the worst cases, of course, is pollution, and you breathe in the pollution, and we know that causes disease. Another one, of course, if it gets hotter and it's extremely hot, people die from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. So the line hasn't been exactly drawn between climate change and epidemic, for instance. So that one is much harder to get your hands around, and I just don't know the answer.
But I would put it to you that it wouldn't be a good thing for a succession of hurricanes to blow through southern Florida, knocking out power to hospitals and to long-term care centers. This would not be good for human health.
Oh, and any kind of severe storm. I mean, having been in the Philippines after Haiyan, I mean, it was a public health catastrophe there for the survivors, because there just is not the ability, the world didn't have the ability to bring enough resources into that location. If a hurricane hit South Florida, or most American cities, essentially any good-sized American city, if a real strong hurricane hit, like we haven't really seen in modern times, there is not the ability to handle the public health problem that comes with that. It's affecting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, because you have there are so many layers of problems to deal with, of debris and standing water and all the issues with cholera and all the third world, we think of third world type diseases that come along with those kind of conditions, and water purity issues that you just couldn't get. There was no way to get enough water into the Philippines. They could not fly it in enough, fast enough. And even when you could drive it in, they couldn't drive it in. They couldn't get it bottled. They couldn't do it, right? So anyway, it has a major public health piece that we normally don't think about.
We've got time for one more question, so I see one in the back here. Go wherever you want.
I'm sorry, he's been right in the census today.
You mentioned the impacts of climate on security in the U.S. You also look at how climate change might affect other nations, both our neighbors and countries further away, that would then come back to affect the U.S. security?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Say that again, which other countries?
So both our nearby countries, but also how climate might affect what China does, or Russia, or other countries like that.
Yeah, well, we could start at the top of the world and go to the Arctic, and with the melting of the Arctic, of course, that's opened up the seaways, and here you have the potential for a land grab, if you will, although some would say, and Admiral Titley, who's a meteorologist and one of our adjunct fellows, that it's very well regulated up there and there will not be a land grab. so he says. But nonetheless, it's going to open up the seaway from China to Europe, and it's a security concern for us, and it's going to be a big security concern for Canada for sure. Yeah, certainly. In the South, to Mexico and South America, they have their own problems with energy and energy consumption and immigration, or migration, if you will. And the same thing applies to energy consumption and production down south. So they don't see it as much as a threat, but it certainly is there. As I mentioned in my graph, Mexico and Canada were both green, so they recognize that it's definitely a threat. Now, when you went down to South America and you look to the western coast, several countries down there just don't believe it's a problem, which is kind of unusual, especially if they're on the coast. But like I said, when 70% of most of the countries in the world view it as a threat to their national security, you know it's an international problem. And I belong to a group called the Global Military Advisory Group on Climate Change. And what it is a couple of flag officers from every country in the world that has a specific interest in this, in climate change, that recognizes the threat. So now we've got international organizations from the military perspective that are viewing it as a threat to their national security. So I think it indeed is a worldwide problem. It's certainly a problem to Canada and Mexico.
Well, I think we've run out of time, but before I go, I want to recognize and thank Senator Warner for coming today, and ask if you wanted to make any comments or...
That's 30 years commenting up here.
Well, it's a great honor to have you with us. You're one of... Thank you, sir. And thank you to both of our speakers today, and thanks especially to the Weather Channel for partnering with us. Take a look at some of the great work that they're doing every night. I've seen new shows on this issue, and I look forward to seeing more. So thank you all for coming. Take a look at our website, and feel free to shoot us a line anytime. Thank you. Thank you.